On April 30th, 1945, at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, in a concrete bunker buried 8 meters beneath the gardens of the Reich Chancellery in the heart of Berlin, Adolf Hitler shot himself in the right temple with his Walther PPK pistol. At that same instant, his wife of less than 40 hours, Eva Braun, bit a cyanide capsule at his side. Outside, barely 400 meters away, soldiers of the 1st Guard Rifle Division of the Soviet Union were scaling the rubble of the Reichstag under an orange sky of gunpowder and fire. The world did not stop. There was no sudden silence. In San Francisco, diplomats from 50 nations were debating at that very moment the founding articles of an organization called the United Nations. In Okinawa, American soldiers were dying under Japanese artillery fire without knowing that the war that had brought them to the Pacific was about to lose one of its architects. In the bunkers of Breslau, besieged for 82 days, 16-year-old German soldiers held positions defending a city that no longer had any strategic reason to resist. As Hitler died in the bunker, the city above his head was a scene of almost impossible scale to comprehend. Berlin on April 30th, 1945, was not a city in the conventional sense of the term. It was a labyrinth of rubble covering 892 square kilometers in which, according to the most conservative estimates, more than 325,000 Soviet soldiers and a German defensive force of around 85,000 personnel were fighting. Regular Wehrmacht soldiers, SS units, Berlin police, Volkssturm, the People's Militia composed of men too old or young for the regular army, and the infamously known Hitler Youth units, boys between 14 and 18 years old wielding Panzerfausts against T-34 tanks. General Helmuth Weidling, appointed commander of the Berlin garrison only on April 23rd, after Hitler had ordered his execution for retreating before the enemy, a charge that was withdrawn when Weidling appeared in person to deny it, had divided the defense into 8 sectors. He had at best 9 soldiers for every Soviet soldier. "I would rather be shot than carry this honor," he had said upon learning of his appointment. On April 27th, Weidling had attempted to communicate to the Führer the reality of what was happening. In his diary, he wrote, "At 5 o'clock in the morning, after a violent bombardment with strong air support, the Russians attacked on both sides of the Hohenzollern-Damm. The dust of bricks and stone hangs in the air like thick fog. The car barely moves. Shells explode everywhere and fragments rain down on us. Everywhere the streets are full of craters and rubble. To protect ourselves from heavy Russian mortar fire, we take shelter in a metro station. In the 2-story building, there are many civilians who have taken shelter there, a mass of frightened people crowded standing." And he concluded, "In my evening situation report, I spoke of the sufferings of the population and the wounded." Hitler seemed in a state of disconnection, unable to really understand what I was telling him. The most fiercely disputed sector on that final day was the Reichstag, the immense neo-Gothic building, which had remained empty since the 1933 fire that the Nazis attributed to a communist agitator to use as a pretext for the Enabling Act, had become the symbol of Soviet victory. Not because it had real strategic value, but because in the imagination of the Red Army, the Reichstag embodied the Nazi regime in a way that no other building could equal. The Soviet internal investigation into who was first to plant the victory flag was considerably more political than factual. Meleton Kantaria, a Georgian like Stalin himself, was chosen, although his flag was raised considerably after others. It was a public relations operation in the midst of the bloodiest urban warfare of the war. Lieutenant Vasily Ustyugov of the Soviet 150th Rifle Division never forgot his first glimpse of the Reichstag at dawn on April 30th. It was early morning and I was about 400 meters away. As the light grew, I saw an enormous dark grey building rising above me, pocked by artillery fire. The SS soldiers defended it with a ferocity born of desperation. They knew that surrendering to the Soviets was not the same as surrendering to the British or the Americans. Ustyugov remembered an incident that same night. I was in the center of the city and it was a night operation. There was an arch to my right leading to a basement. Some light was coming up from it and I went there to take shelter and look at my map. Suddenly, a couple of Germans who must have heard me moving came running up the stairs and ran directly into me. I fired, pure reflex, and hit them both. Their naval caps flew through the air. They were naval cadets, young men sent by Dönitz as a gesture of loyalty to Hitler. They died without having had time to learn the instincts of urban warfare. The 8th Guards Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Vasily Chuikov, had established its headquarters in a 5-story house at the eastern edge of the Tiergarten. Chuikov was the same commander who had defended Stalingrad in 1942. The same force, renamed in 1943, had fought from the Volga to the Oder and was now less than 300 meters from the Reichstag. Captain Anatoly Mereshko, one of his officers, remembered, "We were like a band of gypsies during the Battle of Berlin, constantly moving from place to place in a city wrapped in dust and smoke." On the first day of May, I was on guard in the house next to headquarters. The owners seemed to have abandoned it in a hurry. I helped myself to some cognac to celebrate the holiday, then I heard a strange noise. I was alone, so I took my pistol and went to investigate. I found a German in a bathtub full of water and blood. He had cut his veins. His uniform was folded carefully next to the tub. He was a colonel. After that, my celebratory mood disappeared. At 3:30 in the morning on May 1st, only hours after Hitler's death, a messenger from the Führerbunker appeared at Chuikov's headquarters. It was General Hans Krebs, Chief of Staff of the German Army, fluent in Russian, who wanted to negotiate. The Soviet Lieutenant Andrei Eschpai, bilingual in German, was sent to escort him from the meeting point. While waiting to begin the journey through the ruins of Berlin, Krebs observed the Soviet equipment gathered around him. "What incredible weapons you have," he said aloud, to no one in particular. Eschpai, who knew that conventions required reciprocal deference, replied, "Your Panzerfausts are causing us quite a few problems." Krebs became thoughtful. Then he looked directly at Eschpai. "This is not Moscow," he said. "This is Berlin." When Krebs arrived at Chuikov's headquarters and announced that Hitler had died the day before, the room fell into absolute silence. No one outside the bunker knew that Hitler was dead. "We know," Chuikov replied, in an automatic lie that everyone else present immediately noted. Then he left the room to telephone Zhukov, who in turn called Stalin. Stalin's response was terse. "No negotiations. Only unconditional surrender will be accepted." Krebs insisted that a truce was necessary to swear in the Dönitz government according to the terms of Hitler's will. Chuikov repeated that there could be no truce, only total capitulation of the Berlin garrison. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Krebs was invited to return to the German lines. Before leaving, he returned to headquarters, claiming that he had forgotten his gloves. He looked around the room. "It was so obvious that we couldn't help but laugh," Mereshko remembered. "We asked him, 'Are your gloves that important?'" Everyone understood that Krebs didn't want to return to the bunker. He was clinging to every moment of life. Chuikov took him aside. In a low voice he asked, "And what are you going to do now?" Krebs replied in Russian, "Do my duty to the end." It was obvious that he planned to take his own life. Chuikov paused. "Well spoken for a soldier," he said, and offered his hand. Krebs shook it and left the building forever. He would commit suicide that very night. Meanwhile, on the surface, the battle continued its mechanical and unstoppable course. Goebbels had organized a small farewell ceremony in the green room of the Chancellery for the young defenders of the Hitler Youth. Lieutenant Kuhlmann was summoned to join. He found Goebbels seated at a long table, in lively conversation with a group of boys. His children played on the floor. Kuhlmann's naval cadets mixed with the minister's children. A naval cadet sat at the piano and they began to sing the old martial songs of the movement. Then Goebbels spoke. The boys, who came directly from the Chancellery complex with their bazookas in hand, Panzerfausts that had already destroyed several Soviet tanks that same afternoon, formed around him. Iron crosses were distributed. I could observe Goebbels closely and saw how completely immersed he was in the old rhetoric of defiant resistance, Kuhlmann wrote. His words had no sense in the present situation, and yet they cast a spell from which none of the young seemed capable of freeing themselves. Outside, there was intense and constant bombardment that had left many dead and would leave many more. Here inside, there were songs and lots of young faces, all hypnotized by Goebbels' terrible oratory, Goebbels' children playing innocently, creating a completely unreal atmosphere. I had the feeling that an entire world was collapsing here. A world for which millions of Germans had fought and died, and their blood sacrifice had been absolutely useless. The next day, May 1st, Goebbels and his wife Magda took cyanide and died in the garden of the Chancellery. Before that, Magda had personally entered the bedroom where her 6 children slept. Helga, 12 years old, Hildegard, 11, Helmut, 9, Holdine, 8, Hedwig, 6, and Heidrun, 4, and had administered them a dose of morphine followed by cyanide. The corpses of the children were found by the Soviets still in their nightgowns, hair combed with expressions of peace on their faces. They had died without waking. On May 2nd, General Weidling presented himself at Zwickau's headquarters and signed the unconditional capitulation of the Berlin garrison, effective from noon. It was the surrender that Zwickau had awaited since Stalingrad. At Stalingrad, it had been Field Marshal Paulus who surrendered, but to the neighboring army, not to the 62nd Army that had fought for months within the city. That affront had taken 2 years to erase. Now it was settled. To the north, the race to the Baltic. While Berlin burned, 240 kilometers to the northwest, a completely different force of soldiers was living the strangest and most dizzying days of the war. On April 30th, 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Fraser Eadie commanded the 1st Battalion of Canadian paratroopers, mounted on the tanks of the Royal Scots Greys, racing north across the Mecklenburg Plain. The orders were brutally simple: advance as fast as possible, bypass or run over any obstacle, and reach Wismar on the Baltic coast before the Soviets did. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of the 21st Army Group, had convinced General Eisenhower to send 2 additional armored divisions to support this advance. It was not a military objective in the classical sense, it was a political operation. If Montgomery's forces reached Lübeck and Wismar before the Red Army, they would cut off Soviet access to Denmark. Prime Minister Churchill had stated it unambiguously in a telegram to Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden. Our arrival at Lübeck before our Russian friends from Stettin would save us many troubles later. There is no reason why the Russians should occupy Denmark. Sergeant Andy Anderson, one of the Canadian paratroopers, remembered the experience of that advance as something from another world. As we advanced, the sides of the road became more and more congested. Fully armed German troops were mixing with civilians, prisoners of war, basically everything. The Germans looked tired, beaten down and dirty. We passed by many prisoner camps, some completely overflowing. We couldn't stop, so we just threw them chocolate or rations. The entire 3rd Panzer Division of General Hasso von Manteuffel was in full flight westward to avoid falling into Soviet hands. When German armored units saw the Canadian paratroopers coming, they would stop and wait, hoping to be made prisoners by the Western Allies instead of by the Red Army. German officers came out of their vehicles and saluted as the Canadians passed without stopping. It started to seem almost like an unofficial surrender, Anderson remembered. The situation of the American vanguard was even more delirious. Captain William Knowlton, commanding 65 men of the 87th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, was sent with orders to keep advancing until he found the Russians. They crossed several tens of kilometers of German territory between 2 armies, in both cases without firing a single shot. The Germans let them pass because they believed a massive American force was coming behind. Knowlton knew it and used it. In Lübz, surrounded by clearly hostile German armored units and with communications cut off, he looked directly at the German officer who had approached to confront him and said, "Do you think I would be so stupid as to come this far, take 3 cities and disarm thousands of your soldiers if I didn't have a large force following me?" The German hesitated, scratched his head, and named him commander of the Lübz garrison. Everyone in the room made the Nazi salute and said in unison, "Good evening, Herr Kommandant." That afternoon of April 30th, while Hitler died in the bunker 400 meters from the Reichstag, Canadian paratroopers continued advancing north at full speed. 2 days later, they would arrive at Wismar, just hours before Soviet armored columns. The objective had been achieved. Denmark was safe from Soviet occupation. The Red Army would not reach across the Baltic, and the army of northern Germany, trapped between both forces, would have nowhere to reorganize to prolong the resistance. Hamburg and Flensburg, the government of the dead. On April 30th, 1945, while Adolf Hitler signed his political death certificate in the bunker and then pulled the trigger, Admiral Karl Dönitz was still unaware that he had become the designated successor of the regime that was dying in Berlin. Dönitz was at Plön in northern Germany, directing naval operations from a position that no longer had any real strategic significance. At 10 o'clock in the evening of April 30th, a telegram from Martin Bormann from the bunker tersely informed him that Hitler had named him his successor in his political will. The telegram did not mention the suicide. It informed him that the Führer was still alive and had designated Dönitz as Reich's president and supreme commander of the armed forces. What Dönitz did not know was that Hitler had already been dead since 3:30 in the afternoon. Bormann deliberately withheld that information to extend his own influence in the hours that would follow. The red brick complex of the Mürwik Naval Academy, built by Kaiser Wilhelm II in 1910, stood empty on the outskirts of Flensburg, the northernmost city in Germany, just kilometers from the Danish border. Its Gothic architecture deliberately imitated Marienburg Castle, the historic seat of the Teutonic Knights, that medieval military order that had launched bloody crusades against the Slavic peoples of the East. It was, in a sense, a perfectly chosen stage for what would be the government in the following days, the last remnants of Nazism attempting to prolong its existence under the cover of an appearance of legality. It would not be until May 1st that Dönitz learned that Hitler was dead. That night he issued a radio message to the German nation presenting him as a fallen hero. "Our Führer Adolf Hitler has fallen. The German peoples bow in the deepest mourning and respect." At an early time he recognized the terrible threat of Bolshevism and dedicated his life to opposing it. At the end of his struggle, he died as a hero in the capital of the German Reich. It was, in the first line, a direct lie. Hitler had not died fighting. He had committed suicide in a bunker. But mythology required something else, and Dönitz provided it without hesitation. The government that Dönitz formed in the following days in Flensburg was not a transitional cabinet. It had Otto Ohlendorf as principal advisor on economic matters. The same Ohlendorf who during the Russian campaign had commanded Einsatzgruppe D, one of the mobile extermination squads that murdered tens of thousands of Jews and Slavs in southern Russia and Ukraine. It had Albert Speer as Minister of Industry, and it seriously considered appointing Heinrich Himmler Minister of the Interior, a position it kept vacant for several days before deciding that such an appointment might provoke the Allies to dissolve the government during surrender negotiations. Count Schwerin von Krosigk was appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs. He had studied law in Lausanne and later at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. He had received the Iron Cross in the First World War. And in the first days of May 1945, using the same academic eloquence that he had cultivated in the most prestigious universities of Europe, he issued from Flensburg a series of broadcasts intended to convince the world that Germany had fought a noble war of defense against Bolshevik barbarism. In one of those speeches, von Krosigk uttered a phrase that would enter history, although not in the way he would have wished. He warned that an iron curtain is advancing from the east. The term had been first used by Goebbels in an article of February 25, 1945, in the magazine Das Reich. Von Krosigk popularized it now from Flensburg. It was Nazi propaganda. It was the language of the regime that had just died attempting to survive in the mouths of its heirs. 2 years later, Winston Churchill would adopt it in his famous speech in Fulton, Missouri, marking with it the beginning of the Cold War. Dönitz's strategy was simple and ruthless: negotiate with the Western Allies the greatest number of partial surrenders possible, buying time for German soldiers and civilians to flee westward and escape the Soviets. Surrender in the West, continue fighting in the East. Hamburg would be offered to the British on May 3rd as a gesture of goodwill. The same day, Breslau, besieged by the Red Army for 82 days, would receive orders to continue resisting. The total destruction of that city and its population was to continue. On May 9th, the government of Flensburg would still be standing. It would survive 14 more days before British troops would assault it. On May 23rd, the entire administration was arrested. Heinrich Himmler, who had remained in the vicinity exercising influence from the shadows, was detained and committed suicide while being prosecuted. Breslau, the city that died for nothing. At 185 kilometers southeast of Berlin, the city of Breslau had been under siege for 82 days when Hitler died. The siege had begun in February 1945 when the Red Army closed its grip on this Silesian city that Hitler had designated as a Festung, fortified city, despite the fact that it had no natural defenses that would justify that name. The transformation of Breslau into a bastion had already cost the lives of thousands of civilians forced to abandon their homes in the polar cold of January and march westward. Many had died on the way. Gauleiter Karl Hanke, the Nazi party leader in Silesia, governed the besieged city with terror as the principal instrument. It is estimated that more than 11,000 people were executed during the siege on charges of desertion. 10-year-old children were put to work under the fire of Soviet artillery to clear improvised landing strips within the perimeter. Refusal meant the death penalty. On May 3rd, with Berlin already in Soviet hands, with Hitler dead, with the Dönitz government installed in Flensburg, and with the war practically over on all western fronts, Breslau continued fighting. Field Marshal Schörner telephoned the commander of the garrison, General Hermann Niehoff, and demanded that he keep the city in memory of Hitler. He told him literally, "Fight until the last bullet and until the last man." Soldier Heinz Liedtke wrote to his brother that day, "We are in Breslau like rats in a trap, just waiting for the end. I have already lost hope of getting out of this swamp. We fight, we drink out of desperation, and we live a dissolute life with whores of various nationalities. Yesterday I received a pass for a couple of hours and I went to look for Aunt Trude. From her house on Königsplatz only a burned wall remains. No one knows what became of her and the rest of the tenants, but it seems to me that we will not see her again. I will probably meet the same fate in this damned place." 15-year-old soldier Max Besselt, fighting with the Hitler Youth, wrote in his diary on May 3rd, "No one knows how this will end. We are 14, operating 2 medium 8mm mortars. Before we were classmates in one of Breslau's schools, now we are a weapons team. The oldest in the group just turned 16. For 5 weeks, none of us has rested. We are withdrawing slowly, repelling a constant flow of Russian attacks. We fight in the rubble of these burning buildings, hoping that it all ends." What finally ended the siege was not a military order, but a moral intervention. A group of clergymen from Breslau, Catholic Bishop Josef Ferkscher, Canon Josef Kramer, and 2 Protestant pastors, Joachim Conrad and Ernst Hornig, requested an audience with General Niehoff. Protestant pastor Ernst Hornig spoke directly, "Every day people ask me if everyone must die under bombs and flames, and for what? Every day faith in the party weakens. People no longer see any sense in defending Breslau. In these circumstances, can you answer to God for continuing the defense of the city?" There was silence in the bunker. Niehoff lowered his head for a full minute, then he looked up at the clergyman. "Your concerns are my concerns," he said. The next day, Niehoff cut off all telephone communications with Schörner. When Hanke burst into his command post, threatening to arrest him, Niehoff looked at his soldiers and said slowly, "If anyone is going to make any arrests here, Gauleiter, it will be me." Hanke seemed to deflate. "Forgive my threat," he finally said. "It was not such. But what should I do?" Niehoff looked at him coldly. "Take your own life," he suggested. Hanke did not have the courage. That night he fled the city by plane. On May 6th, General Niehoff convened his general staff. "It is time to put an end to the fighting," he said. "Hitler is dead. Berlin has fallen. The Eastern and Western Allies have shaken hands in the heart of Germany. There is no longer any reason to continue the combat for Breslau. Any further sacrifice is a crime. I have decided to end the fighting and offer the surrender of the city and the garrison to the enemy." The only one who opposed was Otto Herzog, commander of the Volkssturm and an inveterate Nazi. "In a few weeks, the Western Allies and the Soviet Union will be at war, and the German army will be needed again," he exclaimed as he left the room. An hour later, he shot himself. Breslau fell on May 6th, 4 days after the surrender of Berlin. 82 days of siege to end, exactly the same as it would have ended without the siege. Northern Germany, the collapse between 2 armies. The collapse of Germany's northern front on April 30th, 1945 was not a series of orderly battles, but a chaos of almost biblical proportions. Major Erich Mende of the 102nd Infantry Division of the Wehrmacht decorated with the Knight's Cross in January 1945 for having organized the retreat that allowed more than 10,000 civilians to escape the Red Army in East Prussia, described it bluntly. Everything collapsed on April 30th. A Soviet tank thrust from the southeast overran our forces and reached the outskirts of Rostock. The main exit route was cut off, and a mass of our infantrymen climbed aboard our remaining trucks and jeeps as we tried to find another way out. Mende and his soldiers eventually reached the port of Warnemünde, only to find the remaining ships packed with refugees. The men stayed on the dock. Then came a sudden flow of unexpected people. About 500 skeletal people appeared, all dressed in prisoners' clothing. We understood that they were escapees from a nearby concentration camp. The two groups looked at each other in tense and uncomfortable silence. In the small town of Demmin, in the state of Mecklenburg, one of the least-known tragedies of those days unfolded. On April 30th, a Soviet advance column from the 65th Army and the 1st Guards Tank Corps arrived at the outskirts of the town at midday. A white flag was raised on the church tower, and 3 Soviet negotiators approached the anti-tank ditch, promising to respect the civilian population if the town surrendered without a fight. Soviet General Mikhail Panov, commander of the 38th Tank Brigade, had issued an order that very morning to all his officers, warning against looting and demanding disciplined behavior. But then an SS detachment opened fire on the negotiators and killed all 3, then withdrew through the town, blowing up the bridges behind them. Demmin was trapped between the Peene River to the north and west and the Tollensee River to the south. When Soviet troops entered in response, members of the Hitler Youth began shooting at them. In retaliation, Russian soldiers soaked buildings with gasoline and set fire to parts of the town. Nazi propaganda about Bolshevik atrocities had completely saturated the population, and panic triggered something unprecedented, a massive wave of suicides. Entire families took their own lives together, some with guns, others with razor blades or poison, many drowning in the rivers. Others, seeing the city burning, fell into despair. By May 1st, more than 900 people had died this way in Demmin. It was not an isolated case. The actual brutality of the Red Army advancing through eastern Germany, robberies, rapes, fires, had been documented by Soviet commanders themselves with growing concern. The military prosecutor of the Guards of Marshal Zhukov's First Byelorussian Front, Major General Yachinin, prepared a report in early May, noting that violent crimes against the civilian population had diminished considerably, but that looting and rape remained a serious problem. He cited specific cases. Soviet Lieutenant Enchivatov had been arrested drunk, committing house-to-house rapes in the suburbs of Berlin. Soldiers Ivanov and Manankov had been caught raping a series of women, one of whom, very ill, was recovering from a previous suicide attempt following a gang rape. A Sergeant Dorohin had threatened a 15-year-old girl's parents with a pistol and raped her in front of them. Major General Yachinin admitted frankly, "There are many more similar cases, but there was also the other side." In the small town of Greifswald, Colonel Rudolf Hagen gathered emissaries and negotiated directly with the approaching Soviet commander. The rector of the university, Karl Engel, acted as intermediary. At 3 in the morning on April 30th, the meeting with Soviet General Borchev took place and the capitulation was agreed upon. At 11 in the morning, the first Russian tanks entered and Greifswald surrendered in an orderly fashion. The isolated looting that occurred on May 1st was jointly managed by German police and Russian command, with agents at street intersections agreed upon by both sides. Greifswald was preserved. The contrast was brutal. The same troops, the same soldiers could behave in completely different ways depending on the quality of command, the presence of alcohol, whether they had been received with gunfire or with white flags. The Baltic, the tragedy of the Cap Arcona. On April 30th, 1945, in Lübeck Bay, several ships lay anchored under a grey Baltic sky. Among them the Cap Arcona, a large luxury ocean liner built in 1927, whose turbines were completely worn out, which in 1942 had been used to portray the Titanic in a propaganda film commissioned by Goebbels, and which in the early months of 1945 had served to evacuate German soldiers and civilians from East Prussia. Now, withdrawn from active service, the SS had converted it into a prison ship. On board for days were thousands of prisoners from the Neuengamme concentration camp, packed in the holds without food or medical attention. The SS had said they would take them to Sweden, but SS officers from Himmler's headquarters would later declare that the true purpose was to sink the ship with all the prisoners on board. There were no Red Cross markings, there were no accessible lifeboats. And on April 30th, while Hitler died 800 kilometers to the south, the prisoners of the Cap Arcona had no way of knowing that the man who had ordered their confinement had just taken his own life. What would happen 3 days later would be one of the darkest episodes of the war's final days. Flight Lieutenant Derek Lovell of RAF Squadron 197 recalled, "We were told to go to the Baltic and attack ships. On the way, we passed some of our aircraft coming back. They had set the Cap Arcona on fire. It was red hot from bow to stern." RAF intelligence had received reports that the Germans were gathering ships in Lübeck Bay to flee to Norway with Nazi hierarchs escaped from Berlin. 4 squadrons of the 2nd Tactical Air Force would attack the ships on May 3rd. The Cap Arcona, set ablaze, would begin to sink. More than 4,250 prisoners would die. Captain John McCausland, intelligence officer of the 5th British Reconnaissance Regiment, was advancing along the coast when an escaped slave would step into the path of his column. "That ship is full of concentration camp prisoners," he would shout at them. "They are locked in the holds and there are no lifeboats." It would be too late to establish radio contact. McCausland would continue advancing toward Neustadt, 37 kilometers northwest of Lübeck. There they would find concentration camp prisoners who had not received food for 8 days, and then they would arrive at the beach. McCausland would remember that moment for the rest of his life. "Neustadt beach was the most horrible place I have ever seen. The Germans had put prisoners in barges, but some could not set sail, so the guards removed the ladders and machine-gunned everyone inside. Those barges were still full of women and children who had been shot. And on the same beach there were several hundred small children with their skulls smashed in. They had been tied back to back with ropes passed through their mouths and beaten to death. Their bodies were right in front of us." That afternoon, the 5th Reconnaissance Regiment would stop at a small farmhouse several kilometers away. The German owner would try to be kind. "Come see my books," he would say to McCausland. "I have Goethe and Dickens." McCausland could not put into words what he had seen just hours before. "No," he would finally respond. San Francisco, the future being built while the past burned. On that same April 30th, 1945, in San Francisco, California, 50 nations gathered at the San Francisco Conference debated the founding articles of the United Nations organization. The issue dominating the debate was not Hitler or Berlin, it was Poland. The conference had begun on April 25th, the same day Soviet and American troops met at the Elbe at Torgau, a photographic moment that traveled around the world. Soviet Lieutenant Alexander Silvashko and American Lieutenant William Robertson embracing in front of a sign that read, "East meets West." Alistair Cook covered the conference for the American press and described the atmosphere when the first news of surrender arrived. "In less than an hour, radio networks broadcast a dizzying whirlwind of rumors. The city police, put on alert since dawn, relaxed again. By midday, it was established that the Associated Press had announced Victory Day too early." AP correspondent Ed Kennedy had deliberately broken the embargo on news of the Rhine's surrender on May 7th, convinced that keeping the news embargoed was already only a matter of politics, not military security. It was the greatest war censorship crisis in history for the American press. But what was happening in San Francisco had its own dynamics. Young naval correspondent John F. Kennedy, decorated for his service in the Pacific, son of former Ambassador Joseph Kennedy, published a chronicle in the New York Journal from the conference. He wrote with lucidity about what he saw. "This city looks out on the Pacific, and for people here, the war has always been the war against the Japanese. The military men filling the streets have taken it easy. The war in the Pacific is the only war most of them have known, and when you have just returned from months of combat and in a few days you will return to the Pacific fronts, it is difficult to get excited about the end of the war. Victory is far away for them." Kennedy spoke of the dilemma that the Soviet Union posed to the conference with a clarity unbecoming of a 27-year-old journalist. The Russians have a much greater fear than we do of a German resurgence. That is why they will make sure their western borders are secure. No government hostile to Russia will be allowed in the countries that border its territory. They feel they have earned that right to security, and they intend to have it no matter what. At the conference, Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs Molotov informed American Secretary of State Stettinius that the Red Army had arrested 16 Polish peace negotiators, an event that had actually occurred in March and which Stalin had kept secret. It was the first major diplomatic earthquake of the post-war period. The Poles had disappeared. The Western Allies knew nothing. And the order that was being built in San Francisco already had its first deep crack. The Pacific, the war that did not know its engine, had died. For most of the world at war, the death of Hitler on April 30, 1945 was, in immediate terms, completely irrelevant. In Okinawa, the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War continued its course. American forces had landed on April 1st on that Japanese island 560 kilometers from the coast of Kyushu in what would be the last major amphibious operation of the war. On April 30th, 30 days after the landing, the fighting remained of unprecedented ferocity. The Japanese defenders, around 100,000 soldiers of the Imperial Army under the command of General Mitsuru Ushijima, had built a network of tunnels, bunkers, and entrenched positions from which they resisted every American advance. Kamikazes attacked the support fleet constantly. American casualties in Okinawa during the month of April had exceeded the total of the Normandy campaign in proportion. By the time the battle ended on June 22, 1945, more than 12,000 American soldiers had died, about 110,000 Japanese combatants, and it is estimated that between 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians. Hitler had no role in those numbers. His death did not change a single trench in Okinawa. China, where the war had been ongoing since 1937, also experienced no transformation on April 30th. Forces of the Japanese Imperial Army occupied vast stretches of Chinese territory. The tensions between Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang and Mao Zedong's communist forces, which cooperated precariously in the resistance, foreshadowed the civil war that would come later. For peasants in Hunan or soldiers fighting in the mountains of Yunnan, the news that a European dictator had committed suicide in a concrete bunker altered nothing in the reality of their lives. In Burma, on April 30th, 1945, British General William Slim had been executing for weeks one of the most brilliant envelopment maneuvers of the war, the capture of Rangoon. The 14th British and Indian Army advanced southward at dizzying speed, anticipating the monsoon rains that would make movement impractical in a few weeks. Rangoon would be taken on May 3rd. For those soldiers, many of whom had spent 3 or 4 years in the Southeast Asian theater, the war was still everything they knew. In Indochina, Japanese occupation continued. In Indonesia as well. In Korea, occupied since 1910, Japanese domination was absolute. In the Philippines, where General Douglas MacArthur had returned dramatically in October 1944, and where the liberation campaign continued, the war was as real as the day before. Japanese Admiral Suemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, received no urgent message from Tokyo on April 30th ordering a change of strategy because of Hitler's death. No one in the Japanese Imperial General Staff even considered that the event merited a crisis cabinet. Germany was an ally from which Japan had received naval technology and secret communications, but Japan's war was Japan's war, and it had been fighting alone in the Pacific for years. There would be only 3 months of life left for the Japanese Empire after April 30th, 1945. The atomic bomb over Hiroshima would arrive on August 6th, over Nagasaki on the 9th. Formal surrender would be signed on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd. But all that was still to occur. On April 30th, the Pacific War was completely independent of what was happening in Berlin. Michael Jones's book, After Hitler, 2015, articulates it with precision from its European perspective. Even in the Pacific theater, news arrived slowly and fragmented. Japanese submarines patrolling the Indian Ocean did not know exactly what was occurring in Europe. American soldiers embarking in San Francisco on their way back to the Pacific caught the celebrations in the streets, but understood that for them nothing had ended yet. The Vlasov. the Russians who fought against Russia. Among all the secondary actors of those May Days, none better embodied the moral ambiguity of the war than the so-called Vlasov Army. General Andrei Vlasov had been one of the most brilliant commanders of the Red Army. In October 1941, when the Germans advanced toward Moscow in what seemed like the definitive collapse of the Soviet state, Vlasov defended the capital with the 20th Division and was one of the architects of the counter-offensive that stopped the Germans in December. Stalin decorated him, then he sent him to Leningrad, where a breakthrough operation failed due to lack of support. The Second Shock Army was surrounded in the marshes of the Volkhov River. In July 1942, after weeks trying to break the encirclement, Vlasov was captured by the Germans. In captivity, Vlasov made a decision that would condemn him. He decided that the true enemy was not Hitler but Stalin, and that the only way to free Russia from the Bolshevik regime was to collaborate with the Germans to defeat it. He began recruiting Soviet prisoners of war for an anti-Stalin army. Hitler, who despised Slavs as subhuman, rejected for years the idea of arming the Russians, even to fight against the USSR. It was not until February 1945, when it was already too late to matter strategically, that Himmler, without the formal approval of the Führer, authorized the creation of 2 complete divisions of Russian infantry under Vlasov's command. The first was sent to the Oder front. Russians against Russians, on German soil, on behalf of the Third Reich. On April 30th, 1945, one of those divisions, the first, was in western Bohemia. The other, the second, was in Austria under the command of General Mikhail Mandrov, near Linz, Hitler's birthplace. German liaison officer Captain Arthur Mongrovius wrote that day from Linz about his relationship with Mandrov. "I have come to know a Russian general, Mikhail Mandrov, a cultivated and well-educated man. In the presence of an interpreter, I have had many far-reaching conversations with him about God and the world. I have no doubt that many of the officers who joined the Vlasov army did so not out of opportunism or self-interest, but out of a genuine conviction that Stalin's regime has inflicted great damage on the Russian people." The situation of the Vlasov army was desperate. The Germans were being defeated. The Western Allies, although ideologically closer to an anti-communist army, had commitments with Stalin that made it politically impossible to offer them protection. Mongrovius articulated it with a shudder. If the United States were to hand over the Vlasov army, which is against Stalin's regime in its heart, to the Soviets, the inevitable end of that force would be to be hanged on the wall of the Kremlin in Red Square in Moscow. History would prove him right. Almost all of Vlasov's soldiers who fell into Soviet hands were executed or died in the Gulag camps. Vlasov himself was hanged in Moscow in August 1946. The USSR would treat them not as prisoners of war but as traitors to the motherland. But before that end, the 1st Division of the Vlasov army would do something no one expected: save Prague. Prague, the city that fought alone. On April 30th, 1945, while Adolf Hitler shot himself in the Berlin bunker, Prague remained the only major European capital still under German occupation. And in that city, on that exact day, SS Obergruppenführer Karl Hermann Frank issued a message by radio that would be etched in the memory of everyone who heard it. Any attempt at uprising would be drowned in a sea of blood. Frank knew everything. He knew that several fronts of the Red Army were converging toward Bohemia. He knew that General Patton had American forces in Pilsen, 90 kilometers away. He knew that the city's population had been inflaming for weeks. He also knew that in the forests north of Prague camped the 1st Division of the Vlasov army, anti-Stalin Russians fighting under German flag, and that the loyalty of those men, at the moment of the Third Reich's final collapse, was an unknown that no one dared to calculate. For all this, Frank ordered the streets cleared. He instructed the police and army to shoot anyone who disobeyed, and he hurled his warning into the ether with the same certainty with which 6 years before he had organized the extermination of Lidish. But the margin of time between the threat and catastrophe was already a matter of hours, not weeks. In the headquarters of Czech officers who had been preparing the uprising since winter, General Karol Kutlwasser's Bartos command for the city interior, General František Sluneko's Alex command for the suburbs, reports of the situation in Berlin had been circulating for days in the form of rumors picked up on clandestine radios tuned to the BBC. No one yet knew for certain that Hitler was dead. But the speed of the Soviet advance from the north and the visible paralysis in the German commands in the city said enough. Czech partisans had been executing the Battle of the Rails for weeks, sabotage of railroad lines, attacks on ammunition depots, ambushes of supply trains. The Germans had responded by concentrating in Bohemia some of their hardest units, elements of the 6th SS Panzer Division, the 1st and 4th Panzer Divisions, and several combined armies that in total numbered more than 60,000 armed soldiers in the immediate surroundings of Prague, plus 30,000 in garrison within the city. It was a crushing disproportion, and yet in apartments, in taverns, in sacristies, resistance groups discussed whether to launch the uprising that night the next day or wait for the Americans to arrive. The Czech National Council, formed by representatives of the various clandestine political parties to assume government after liberation, opposed any premature action. The failure of the Slovak uprising in September 1944, crushed with massacres and reprisals, was a difficult argument to refute. But other sectors pointed out that clashes with the German garrison had already begun spontaneously at several points in the city and that the people of Prague could not be contained much longer. That afternoon of April 30th, while the bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun burned in a garden in Berlin, the Czechs of Prague did not know it. They heard Frank's threat on the radio, saw German tanks on the corners and waited. 5 days later, when Radio Prague would launch its call, calling all Czechs, the entire city would rise up in a matter of hours. But that was still to occur. On April 30th, Prague waited with the tension of one who knows that the decisive moment approaches without being able to calculate when it will arrive. Reims and Karlshorst, 2 surrenders, a wound in the alliance. While Hitler died in Berlin at the Allied headquarters in Reims, France, there was no surrender negotiation in progress. What there was a calculated wait, an architecture of pressure built over weeks, and the certainty that German collapse was already a matter of days. General Eisenhower, supreme commander of the Allied forces, had left clear instructions long ago. He would not accept any partial surrender designed to separate the Western Allies from the Soviets. The Donetsk government, which on that April 30th still officially ignored that Hitler had died, would try exactly that in the following days, offer capitulations by sector, buying time for his soldiers to flee westward and avoid falling into Soviet hands. Eisenhower anticipated it and blocked it in advance. Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg would arrive in Reims on May 5th with partial proposals. Eisenhower rejected him without hesitation, unconditional surrender on all fronts, simultaneously, or there would be no deal. The next day, May 6th, Eisenhower set an ultimatum. If by midnight on May 8th the total surrender had not been signed, he would close the Allied lines to German soldiers attempting to cross them westward and resume bombing of remaining German positions. Dönitz in Flensburg understood there was no margin. He sent Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations of the Wehrmacht High Command, with authorization to sign. At 2:41 in the morning of May 7th, 1945, in a schoolroom converted into a war room, Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German armed forces to the Western Allies and, simultaneously, to the Soviet command. The ceremony lasted exactly 20 minutes, but what followed was not the silence of the end. It was the beginning of a diplomatic crisis that nearly fractured the Grand Alliance at the last moment. Soviet General Ivan Susloparov, the only Russian representative at the ceremony, had sent multiple telegrams to Moscow requesting instructions. None received a response. He signed anyway, relying on a clause that he himself had insisted on inserting, that a new ceremony could be held if any of the Allies requested it. When Stalin learned what had happened in Reims, his reaction was controlled anger. General Shtymenko of the Soviet High Command remembered an emergency meeting in the Kremlin that same morning. Stalin paced the carpet, thinking aloud, "The Western Allies have negotiated this directly with Dönitz, and nothing good will come of it. It seems like some kind of shady deal, not a true surrender agreement. None of our main commanders or government officials were present. We have suffered most from Hitler's aggression and have made the greatest contribution to our common victory. Russia broke the spine of the fascist beast, and now, at the end of the war, this happens." Stalin demanded a second ceremony in Berlin, represented by Marshal Zhukov. The Reims agreement would remain preliminary. The Berlin one would be definitive. Eisenhower, with his characteristic nobility of character, responded immediately. Instead of insisting that the Soviets accept what had already been signed, he assumed responsibility for the misunderstanding and accepted the second ceremony. He also sent an urgent communiqué to both the American and British governments, requesting that they formally commit to not accepting any partial German surrender that excluded the Soviets. The second signing took place on May 8, 1945 at midnight at the School of Military Engineering in Karlshorst, a suburb of East Berlin. The room was large, about 18 by 12 meters, with 2 levels and a small balcony on one side. Marshal Zhukov presided, Field Marshal Keitel signed for Germany. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder signed for the Western Allies, along with General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny for France and General Karl Spaatz for the United States. Even at that moment, Keitel tried to delay. He wanted more time for his troops to receive ceasefire orders. He wanted the clause on the immediate surrender of weapons and equipment eliminated. Zhukov kept it. The impasse was resolved only when Zhukov shouted across the room, "I give you my word as a soldier!" It was already past midnight. War correspondent Kay Summersby described the moment of the signature. The Field Marshal carefully removed a grey glove before taking the pen. He looked with disdain at the bustling journalists, then scribbled his signature as if he wanted to dispatch dirty work as quickly as possible. Then Zhukov gave an order to leave. The Nazis rose as in a parade pass. Keitel raised his baton again in a brief salute. They left the room with an exit as dramatic as their entry. What followed was a 4-hour party with orchestra on the balcony, 29 individual toasts, a banquet of cold dishes, seafood, pastries, and vodka. Marshal Zhukov, who according to Summersby ended up dancing the Russkaya, made the second toast, after the obligatory one to Stalin, in honor of General Eisenhower, whom he praised as a great general and one of the most outstanding sons of America. For the Soviet Union, May 9th would be their victory day, for the Western Allies, May 8th. 2 days of celebration that reflected not only different time zones, but the reality of 2 partially distinct wars that had coincided in the same enemy and the same result, but not in the same sacrifices. The world without knowing it, London, Moscow, New York. On May 8, 1945, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, British summertime, Winston Churchill addressed the country from the BBC. Yesterday morning, at 2:41 at headquarters, the representative of the German High Command and the German government, General Jodl, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, naval and air forces in Europe before the Allied Expeditionary Force and simultaneously before the Soviet High Command. Today, this agreement will be ratified and confirmed in Berlin. The German war has ended. When Churchill pronounced those last 4 words, "The German war is therefore at an end," from windows opening onto the congested Whitehall, from radios turned on in hospitals, in homes, in workshops, in factories, from loudspeakers installed in the streets throughout all of Great Britain, there came a roar that had no precedent. In Paddington Green Hospital, a volunteer nurse was holding a small girl's hand at the moment Churchill spoke. When the speech ended, the girl asked, "What does it mean?" The nurse responded as best she could. "That you will see lights in the streets and windows lit up at night, that you will never hear a siren again." The girl looked at her with absolute incredulity. "Never again a siren," she repeated in a low voice. She could not believe it. Writer Molly Panter Downs, correspondent for The New Yorker in London, captured the character of that day with precision. When the day finally came, it was like no other that anyone could remember. It had a flavor of its own, a spontaneity that gave it something of the quality of an enormous and happy village party. And she added with nuance, all day the deadly past was for most people just beneath the surface of the beautiful and safe present. There were no celebration sirens. The government had decided against it for fear of awakening too many painful memories in those who had heard those same sirens announce bombings for 5 years. Instead, the bells of all the churches in England rang out, the tugboats on the Thames blew their horns, airplanes flew over London dropping coloured signals over the crowd. In Stonyburn, a small locality in West Lothian in Scotland, William Paton described the celebrations. The town was bathed in flags, there was singing and dancing and a procession. The festivities were interrupted at 9 in the evening to listen to the king speak. That night, bonfires were lit on every corner and people sang until the early hours of the morning. King George VI spoke at 9 in the evening. For those who heard him, it was his best speech. With an emotion that crossed his tendency to stammer, "Today we give thanks to Almighty God for a great deliverance." Speaking from the oldest capital of our empire, battered by war, but never for a moment discouraged or intimidated, I ask you to join me in that act of thanksgiving. Let us remember those who will not return. In Moscow, May 9th was Victory Day. Soviet citizens learned that the war had ended only at that moment, not the day before. The Reich's signature had not been reported to the Soviet population. It was, for the Russians, as if it had not occurred. What mattered was Karlshorst, Zhukov, Berlin. Journalist Nina Koshova had written to a friend from Moscow on May 1st. "I send you my best wishes for the holiday. For the first time in years, everyone in Moscow is truly happy. Joy is everywhere." Last night, all the blackout restrictions were lifted in Moscow. Now the city is bathed in light. This is the second night that I don't have to lower the black netting curtains. The room seems different, bright and welcoming. On May 9th, that light that had returned was celebrated with fireworks for hours. Artillery salvos thundered throughout the capital, the streets filled with people who hugged, wept, and sang. It was the victory of a people that had lost 27 million people, soldiers and civilians, in the most destructive war in their history. In New York, the news of the surrender unleashed celebrations in Times Square that newspapers the next day would describe as uncontrollable. Thousands of people blocking traffic, confetti falling from buildings, strangers embracing. CBS tried to maintain composure in its broadcast. It is obviously a fact, but it is not official. Official is official, and there, for all purposes of absolute definition, goes the day that we thought should be called VE Day. In the Louisiana bayou, Anne Ralph was on a train when she heard the bells of the small towns she passed. "I didn't know what was happening until the train stopped, and someone told us that the war in Europe had ended. In New Orleans, people literally danced in the streets. They sang, danced, jumped in and out of fountains. It was like Mardi Gras." The soldiers at the end, the silence of those who fought. But on the front lines, among the soldiers who had lived the war up close, the reaction was radically different. Lieutenant William Preston of the 65th Infantry Division of General Patton's army wrote to his brother from Germany, "The war in Europe is over. I can barely believe it because it seems like it was yesterday when we saw our first action on the Siegfried Line. On VE Day, I sat by an open window and watched and listened as thousands of German soldiers, thousands of them, passed on their way to a prisoner of war camp. I don't know what the reaction is at home. On a patched-up radio, we heard that confetti and streamers fell from the buildings of New York. We heard that there were wild celebrations in the streets of London, but the frontline troops did not celebrate. Most of the men simply read the story in the division bulletin sent to the troops, said something like, 'I'm glad,' and walked away. Perhaps it was different inside them, or perhaps they were too tired or thinking of home or of comrades who did not live to see the victory." Corporal Tom Renouf of the Black Watch Regiment of the 51st Scottish Mountain Division had fought from the beaches of Normandy to Bremerhaven. "We were told that the war was over, and at first it simply didn't sink in," he said. "We had lived day by day, simply trying to survive. And then, gradually, something opened up, and I started to realize that I was one of the lucky ones and how fortunate I had been to survive. And then other things began to happen. I was no longer listening for bullets and mortars coming at me. I was no longer looking for enemy positions that might be shooting at us. I no longer smelled the cordite from exploding shells. It had all disappeared, and in its place I was listening to the birds, smelling the flowers, enjoying the scenery, just looking at the beauty of the world. What a contrast, from one extreme to the other, and I felt like I had been born again." Lee Dickman of the 11th Company of Engineers of the South African Army was near Klagenfurt in Austria when midnight came on May 8th to 9th. He described it in language that no official chronicler could have fabricated. Some god, somewhere, said, "Let there be light again," and there was light. The searchlights swept magic wands back and forth. The parachute flares, bright white, descended slowly. Star grenades tore flashes of flame from the sky. Colored lights formed arcs of red, green, and orange. Tracers dropped red necklaces into the cupped hands of the night. Everyone was throwing anything that would explode into the sky in an outpouring of joy, of relief, of hope. I walked slowly through the darkness of this small Austrian town. Golden drops of light spilled over my feet when the blackout curtains were pulled back. The shutters burst open and the street lamps flickered, wavered, and then burned brightly. I remembered comrades who had died at my side, the horror of the bombs falling, the grim surrender of a disillusioned German soldier. And I thanked that anonymous God for the fact that I, however minimally, had helped banish the evil that had shadowed Europe for so long. It was VE Day, the killing had ended, I could go home. The legacy, what remained after the fire. The legacy of April 30th, 1945 did not complete itself on that day. It continued to branch out over weeks, years, and decades. In Breslau, the city that fell 6 days after Hitler, the Soviet soldiers who entered on May 6th found a landscape of near total devastation. Soldier Alexander Fedotov wrote to his mother, "It may sound strange, but what I have longed for most over the past months is silence. Silence from the sound of cannons and falling grenades. That afternoon, for the first time in my life, I heard nightingales singing in the bushes." In the Ravensbrück camp, liberated on April 30th, Soviet Captain Boris Makarov found around 3,000 sick women, many of them Russian, in conditions that defied description. There had been medical experiments, mass sterilizations, amputations. The SS had marched more than 20,000 prisoners in a death march days before. Those who remained were those who were too weak to walk. In the Theresienstadt camp in Bohemia early on May 9, 1945, the last major camp liberated by the Red Army, inmate Erich Kessler was awakened by the sound of tanks. He ran out into the hospital courtyard. The Soviet armored vehicles were tearing down the perimeter fence. "I ran through the hospital courtyard," Kessler recalled. "Their armored vehicles were already tearing down the fence. A procession of tanks moved constantly down the road toward Prague. It was completely dark, but the light of their headlights lit up the way. We cheered them and everyone sang the Internationale, each as best they could, German, Czech, Polish, Hungarian, all mixed together, but each version rendered with enthusiastic gratitude." In Western Europe, the concentration camps discovered by the Anglo-American Allies had caused a shock that was unprecedented. Belsen, liberated on April 11th by the 11th British Armoured Division, had 60,000 inmates in conditions of extreme illness and malnutrition, with another 10,000 corpses scattered throughout the compound and in open graves. Dachau, liberated on April 29th by troops of the 42nd and 45th American Divisions, had left soldiers in a state of shock. There was an abandoned freight train with dozens of cars and inside hundreds of corpses. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks of the 45th Division recalled that battle-hardened veterans became extremely distressed. "It took about 30 minutes before I could restore order and discipline." The liberation of these camps was simultaneously the most brutal possible demonstration of what the war had served. Sergeant Trevor Greenwood of the 9th Battalion of the Royal Tank Regiment, stationed in the German town of Schüttorf, wrote to his wife in late April about a painting he found in the officers' room of a German house. At first glance, it seemed to be a moorland landscape, with silver birches and flowering heather. But upon closer inspection, the horizon line had something strange about it. "This irregularity is nothing more than an entire concentration camp," he described. "Clearly visible are the watchtowers for machine guns, the reflector towers for night use, the barbed wire enclosure that encloses the wooden huts for the prisoners, and separately, more imposing brick buildings for personnel." The painting was solemnly destroyed by the officers. April 30th was also the day when 30,000 survivors of Dachau, those still alive, began to understand that they had survived. Engineer Donald Jackson described the work of clearing the camp of the dead. "We used carts to pile up the bodies, and we forced German civilians to do the loading. It was a deliberate exercise in moral confrontation. The same cities that had ignored or tolerated the camps for 12 years would have to look at what had been done in their name.